Afternoon, everyone. We have the pleasure today to be hosting the book presentation of Dr. Brent Crosson. The book's called Obeah and the Remaking of Religion in Trinidad. I was reading about this now before the book presentation, and a quote stuck with me. Obeah has been described as the magical art of resistance because it gave its practitioners a sense of empowerment in the face of oppression. Hopefully we can talk more about that. This book won the 2021 Clifford Gibbs Prize from the Society for the Anthropology of Religion and is currently shortlisted for the Albert Rabatu Prize for the best book in African religions. The book was published in 2020 by Chicago Press. And 2 years ago, we were in process of inviting Dr. Brent Crosson to present it in an in-person event, but as you all remember, the pandemic started. So now we finally have the opportunity to discuss this publication. Dr. Crosson is a cultural anthropologist. He's associate professor of religious studies at UT Austin. His research has focused on contestations over the limits of legal power, science, race, and religions in the Americas. His current research focuses on climate change, religions, and conceptions of energy. In fact, we were just discussing an event he's planning for the end of the month in April. We also have today the presence of Dr. Nadia Mosquera. Dr. Mosquera is a postdoctoral provost fellow at UT Austin. She holds a joint appointment between the Department of Geography and Environment and the Center of Women and Gender Studies. She is an interdisciplinary ethnographer interested in race and Blackness in Latin America. She completed her PhD in development studies at the University of Sussex, and she is originally from Venezuela. So now I would like to invite Dr. Crosson to start his book presentation.
Thanks so much, Paloma Diaz, and for organizing this and everyone at LLILAS. And also thank you to Dr. Mosquera for being kind enough to respond to this book. So I'm really pleased to be able to do this after the pandemic and everything that's happened. I want to introduce the work by reading a bit from the preface, and I'll talk a little bit about what this word Obeah means, this word that has been criminalized throughout the Anglophone Caribbean. And I'll talk a little bit about Trinidad as well. If it's a very complex place, and I'll provide a little bit of background. So I'll share my screen and show some of the photos that also appear in the book, which I either took during field work or were taken by photographers that I worked with during my field research in Trinidad. So the cover photograph of the book shows an important moment following the police shooting of 3 people at my field site, which I'll talk about later, which was pivotal for my rethinking of what I was doing in studying Obeah. So in many ways, I did not want to write a book about Obeah. After all, the long-standing criminalization of Obeah had marked Rio Moro, a pseudonym for the place in rural southern Trinidad where I have done field work for over the past decade. It marked it as a backward place of superstition, its association with Obeah. And backward was not the direction that those whom I have come to love wanted to go. The first time I met Papoy, pictured here, the man who has become a second father to me, he told me to set down my backpack and then declared we were going to his garden. "Forward ever, backward never," he exclaimed, quoting Maurice Bishop, the Grenadian revolutionary leader who was tragically killed in a series of events that ended with the US invasion of Grenada in 1983. Moving forward, however, meant taking off our shoes. With his cutlass or machete in hand, Papoy scaled the impossibly steep slopes of his garden, pictured in the background here. The garden's slopes had become a slippery mud paste in the rainy season. Following his lead, I also took off my shoes to get a better grip with bare feet. Later, he told me that he had only let me stay with him because I had been willing to move forward barefoot. While many Trinidadians might see Papoy, a barefoot, dreadlocked Rastafarian who was poor by Trinidadian standards, as a vestige of the past, he was resolutely forward-looking. Papoy saw small-scale farming as the future, not the oil and gas that drove Trinidad's economy. Like many Rastas, his attitude toward Obeah was often derisive, echoing colonial views of the practice as backward superstition. Nevertheless, he claimed to be fully capable of practicing Obeah. If a couple came to him with marital strife, he told me, he had a foolproof spiritual experiment to treat their problems. He would give them some holy water and instruct them in its use. Every time they began to quarrel, they would have to put some of the holy water in their mouths and keep it there for 5 minutes. In this way, Papoy avowed, sarcastically, they could vanquish the spiritual forces that neighbors had sent to destroy their relationship. When I started long-term field research, I thus perceived Obeah as something that people in Rio Moro, who are often stigmatized as backward and superstitious by this association, wanted to distance themselves from, whether through humor, disavowal, or outright condemnation. I wanted to focus on the questions of justice, police brutality, and socioeconomic inequality that I saw as more pressing concerns for my lower class interlocutors in Trinidad. Even as national newspapers fixated on the alleged role of Obeah, or witchcraft as they called it, in episodes of so-called demonic possession at the local secondary school, the area's lack of piped water service and the military occupation of Papoy's village went largely unreported. And so on this map of Trinidad, which a student at the National University drew while he was attending lecture, I guess they were somewhat bored. It draws a lot of references. There's a lot of sarcasm in this map. But the place where I did fieldwork is in southern central Trinidad. And so this episode that was reported in national newspapers about the so-called mass demonic possessions at the secondary school are marked here on this map with the words devil-possessed children, which I've highlighted. And so Trinidad is divided in the national imaginary between a southern and eastern part of the island that's marked through associations with rurality, underdevelopment, and the supernatural on this map. Sukuyans being kind of flying female mythical characters, duendes being small men with their feet on backwards. Bush, just referring to forest. A woman who has never seen Port of Spain at the very bottom of the map refers to the supposed rural isolation, and a woman who has never been to the capital, Port of Spain. Now, these tropes deny a history of cosmopolitanism, mobility, and intellectualism that I've detailed elsewhere, but it's important to note that at least in the national imaginary, these ideas do prevail, and they mark the region where I worked as through an association with Obeah and the supernatural. So while newspapers reported on the so-called mass demonic possessions at the local secondary school, they failed to pay the same attention to the military occupation of the local playing field or the lack of running water in the area. Police and military helicopters used the community's only playing field as a landing pad, from there flying into the hills where people farmed to burn swaths of cultivation and carrying back large containers filled with marijuana. They chopped the best marijuana for their own uses, it was explained to me, and they burned the rest. The media frenzy around the alleged Obeah in Rio Moro only served to reinforce the rural area's marginalization, implicitly authoring state violence against a backward region. It was the force of the dead, however, that changed the attitudes of both Papoy and me toward Obeah. Like many stigmatized terms for African-identified religious practices, Obeah is associated with the powers of the dead, or Jumbis, to use the Congo-inspired Trinidadian word for spirits of the dead. When the police killed 2 young women and 1 man in Rio Moro, the talk of Obeah and the powers of the dead permeated the community's calls for justice. This tragedy opened up for me a new way of seeing Obeah as a technology of justice making, and it began a years-long process in which I interviewed and accompanied spiritual workers in Rio Moro. Spiritual workers involved in responses to this police violence spoke about their work not as frivolous superstition, but as science or experiments. Using the very terms that epitomized forward-looking progress in narratives of modernization, spiritual workers placed Obeah resolutely within present and ongoing concerns of justice. For Papoy, his own change in attitude came with the death of his wife, Vita, pictured here. In the wake that took place on each night following her death, as was customary, and was accompanied by drumming, he danced with Vita's spirit. While this was happening, I was inside working on the eulogy that I had been charged with writing, but the shouts that accompanied a crescendo in the drumming in the pre-dawn hours called my attention. I saw Papoy bent at the waist, dancing with his arms folded across his chest. And I felt what was happening before anyone told me he was dancing with Vita. As dawn broke, the drummers and gravediggers piled into the back of a pickup truck, beating the drums all the way to the cemetery. As we took turns digging her grave with a single shovel, my friend Rati, pictured here, turned to me and said, "I don't believe what the preacher and them say. When you dead, you doesn't go away to some other place. You just stay here on earth." After all, Rati was here at the gravesite, he told me, because Vita had entered his dreams that morning to wake him up. Papoy always told me that when it came to religion, he did not believe until he experimented. As Vita continued to visit him and to make things happen for him, he told me he was turning from the Protestant Christianity of his youth and the Bible-based Rastafarianism of his recent years toward, quote, an African way of being. Rather than a recognized religion, this way of being was defined by the very thing that had stigmatized Obeah as a malevolent practice, the active presence of the dead in the world of the living. This book is thus animated by the dead, in particular by the spirits of Vita and one of the victims of the police shootings, who is known as Arlena in these pages. In many ways, I am not sure of all that Obeah means, but I know what Obeah has done, and if Obeah can signify living with the powers of the dead, afflictions and allies, then this work is a result of Obeah. And so in the introduction to the book, I talk about many things, but I make the point that I'm not looking to treat Obeah so much as a bounded object, as some kind of local tradition, so much as a lens with which to redefine religion, justice, ethics, race relations, and science in Trinidad and beyond. And so these terms are foundational for what we know as modernity, and Obeah redefines them. Science is a synonym for Obeah, and spiritual workers talk to me about their practices as experiments, hence the title of the book, Experiments with Power. Each of the chapters redefines one of these terms, with the first 3 chapters dealing with religion, justice, and ethics, the 4th and 5th chapters dealing with race relations and secularism, and the final chapter dealing with science. In this way, I follow Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot in reversing the object of study and the agent of study in much academic research. Rather than an object of study with the academic as the agent of study, I seek to treat Obeah as theory, as an agent of study, and to treat my informants not as informants, but as theorists who had something to say about the key terms that have defined modernity. The first 3 chapters, the foundational event for thinking through these terms, the police shooting of 3 people at my field site, 2 women and 1 man. Oh, and this is Josh L. wearing the hair that Vita lost during chemo after her death. Josh L. is the grandson of Papoy. So the pivotal event in the first 3 chapters of the book is the police shootings of 3 young people. And pictured here is the main character in the interludes of this book, Arlena, with her coffin pictured here at the crossroads where police opened fire on her. And spiritual work is being done on this coffin in order to exhort her spirit to seek justice for her death. So I'll read the first interlude, which describes the police shooting. Interlude 1, number 21 Junction. The crossroads where the police opened fire on Arlena and her two friends was known as number 21 because it had been the home to the 21st and final scale of the now defunct National Sugarcane Company in Trinidad. Arlena had been hanging out at a local bar early on a Friday evening when her friends Jackie and Otis had suggested they go to get food. The nearest open food stall was a 10 to 15-minute drive through abandoned cane fields to number 21 Junction. People used to drive ox carts loaded down with the charred green of cane to the crossroads. But with the company closed, people drove to number 21 Junction to get barbecue at a food stall that had recently opened there. As neither Arlena nor her two friends had a car, they asked to borrow the automobile of another man who was hanging out at the bar. Unbeknownst to them, organized crime networks had allegedly paid a corrupt police unit to assassinate this man over a business conflict. As the friends climbed into the car and began their journey, they passed a police unit that most likely identified the vehicle and sped via an alternate route through the cane fields. 7 officers showed up at number 21 Junction, telling employees to close down the barbecue stall as they remained in wait for the vehicle's arrival. Arlena knew the back roads that passed through the cane fields well, as she had grown up in her grandmother's house just off the main road. At sunset, the twisted stalks of cane left to grow wild turned a deeper green in the golden light. As they neared the junction, Arlena would have driven past the public cemetery where a clearing of white tombstones and the red earth of fresh graves broke the monotony of cane. This was the same cemetery where more than a week later, her spiritual father, Bishop Dawes, who's another key figure in this book, would lay Arlena down, not to rest, but to rise and seek justice. This place would have been one of the last things that Arlena saw before driving into a hail of bullets at number 21 Junction. The 7 police waiting for their car made no attempt to stop the vehicle and find out who was inside of it before pulling the triggers of their high-powered automatic weapons. The car spun to a stop in the middle of the crossroads. And as on so many other occasions of fatalities at the hands of the police, the officers would claim that they were involved in a shootout with dangerous criminals and had returned fire. The 3 people in the borrowed vehicle were all in their 20s, unarmed, and with no criminal records. As autopsies later showed, Arlena did not die in that initial hail of bullets. She was shot in her back at point-blank range an hour later with police weapons. Something wrong in Trinidad and Tobago, the cousin of one of the 3 victims told me a week later. Something wrong. They shooting people wrongfully and everything is exchange of gunfire, but you never hear a policeman get shoot is a lie, and a lie will always be a lie. But trust me, if you don't pay by the arm of the law, you are going to pay by Obeah. And so in chapter 1, what Obeah does do, it redefines religion and the relationship between religion, justice, and force through the lens of this justice-seeking Obeah in the wake of Arlena and her friend's death. Obeah played a key role in the protests following these deaths, and the chapter's title takes its name, What Obeah Does Do, from one of the most popular chants that protesters used to protest these police killings. The chant was, the police don't know what Obeah does do. And so invoking this word was invoking a sense of justice outside or alongside the state legal system. Pictured here in this article, the brother of one of the man killed by the police performs a ritual in the middle of the crossroads where he was shot. And this ritual was construed as an act of Obeah. The police monitoring the protests just after this ritual had left the scene, and people saw this as the power of Obeah to scare off the police officers. Still, the attorney that came to offer his services to the protesters and the families of the deceased urged the protesters to stop protesting, saying justice is not in the road. But this chapter sees justice as a performative act. And this, in this picture here, Bishop Dawes, Arlena's spiritual father, stands on top of her grave mound proclaiming no grave can hold this body down and pointing in the direction of the rising sun, just as the sun sets in the west. So chapter 1 redefines the relationship between religion and violence, because Obeah has often been stigmatized as being related to some kind of force. So this chapter focuses on spiritual workers' responses to the police shootings in Rio Moro as an ethnographic basis for rethinking the relationship of religion and violence and ethics. As this chapter suggests, Obeah intimated a justice-making force that exceeded the limits of state law, and as with most systems of justice, potential harm was a part of its power. This chapter thus works toward a new interpretation of Obeah and spiritual harm to gain a different understanding of the relationship between religious practice and violence more broadly. I reconceptualize religion as a claim about the location of sovereign power, making religious practice inextricable from questions of force, violence, and justice. And so it's not exceptional that religion should be associated with some kinds of force. However, due to what I call the moral racial economy of religion making, Obeah is particularly stigmatized for these associations. And so Obeah is not alone in having associations with justice and force. However, it's particularly stigmatized in this way. And so in this chapter, I contrast the response to the police shootings with the response following the quote unquote mass demonic possessions at the local secondary school. After these so-called possessions, I found that people in Rio Moro disavowed Obeah. However, during the protests for Arlena's death, people avowed Obeah as a justice-making force. And so I found that unlike earlier accounts which had talked about the attitudes of Caribbean peoples as being negative or ambivalent towards Obeah, I found that, that opinions about Obeah and attitudes could change based on the context and were much more complicated than what I call the colonial false consciousness model had intimated. So the book is structured in 3 sections: the depths, the nations, and the heights. And these are also the 3 different spiritual realms that structure the world of African religions in Trinidad. We can think about this simply as the depths being below the earth, the nations being the spiritual nations that spread across the earth, and the heights being what is above the earth. But these are not simply earthly realms, but spiritual realms. And in this, I follow a practice called mourning, which is a spiritual Baptist practice of African religions in Trinidad, which involves the extended blindfolding of a mourner in a kind of initiation or baptism ritual. This is the baptism that would conclude the period of mourning. A mourner is blindfolded so that their spirit travels in these realms of the depths, the nations, and the heights. In the depths, one might encounter skeletons or the biblical figure of Ezekiel, who was sent down into the valley of dry bones to make skeletons live. In the nations, one might travel to the spiritual nations of India, Africa, and China, the homelands of Trinidad's laboring populations. And in the heights, one might encounter high science, which is the focus of chapter 6, and the relationship between Obeah and science, as the 2 words are synonyms in the Anglophone Caribbean. I'll briefly read the Interlude 3 to balance the load and talk about the reconceptualization of ethics, and then give a very brief synopsis of the rest of the book. So Interlude 3 to balance the load. So chapter 1 is about the relationship between religion and violence. Chapter 2 reconstrues religion as experimental, taking the words of my interlocutors seriously in talking about Obeah as experiments, rethinking religion not so much as only traditional, but as also experimental. And chapter 3 rethinks ethics through conceptions of balance. And so Interlude 3, as do all the following interludes are based on Arlena's spiritual travels through mourning in these worlds of the heights, the depths, and the nations. So Interlude 3 involves Arlena's travels to Africa before she was shot by the police. Interlude 3, to balance the load. Arlena was lying on the earthen floor of the morning room in the Spiritual Baptist Church on Cha-Cha Trace in Rio Moro. But when she opened her spiritual eyes, she found herself in an immense open-air market in the nation of Africa. She made her way among a dense proliferation of stalls, each with distinct wares and smells. She remembers passing the odor of burnt meat, lavender, and leather until she came upon an old woman with deeply creased hands and a brown dress, surrounded by a number of covered baskets. Although she could not see the woman's eyes, hidden as they were by a brown shawl wrapped around her head, she heard the woman's voice offering her a choice between two large baskets, indicated by her wrinkled hands. One basket held the good, happiness, joy, levity. The other held the bad, pain, suffering, gravity. As in other key moments of her spiritual travels, Arlena was presented with a choice that was also a test, and her ability to move forward in the nation of Africa was premised upon her choosing the right basket. Instead of choosing between the two baskets, however, Arlena picked up both of them to balance the load, as she told the old woman. She heard the woman laugh with approval as she raised her head from the shadows of her shawl to look at her. Arlena saw a dark calabash bowl in the hollow of the shawl where the woman's face would be. Inside the bowl was a flickering light. Arlena would carry the calabash bowl and the light inside of it back to Trinidad. This was how she first came to know Africa and became a calabash woman, charged with wielding this water-bearing gourd as the ritual implement of Africa during her church's spiritual Baptist services. When she came back to herself on the floor of the morning room in Cha-Cha Trace, Bishop Dawes told her that the woman she had met was Mama Lata, an Orisha that exists only in Trinidad and whose name is French patois for Mother Earth. Mama Lata, she came to understand, had shown her that Africa was not simply a place, but also an ethos of difficult balance that refused a mutually exclusive choice between good and bad. And so chapter 3 redefines ethics, using people's talk of balance and also electricity to think about balance rather than a choice, a mutually exclusive choice between good and bad as the foundation for a kind of ethics. And so this is a refutation of the way that religion and virtue ethics have been conflated in anthropology and just in common sense. The chapter also deals with justice and the idea of justice as a kind of balancing of forces, of good and bad forces. The next two chapters travel to the realm of the nations and tell Arlena's story of standing between the Ganges and the Nile. In Trinidad, populations claiming descent from Africa and from India represent the two largest groups, each about 40% of the population. And so Arlena recounts standing in the charged space between Africa and India as a kind of impasse in her spiritual travels. Chapter 5, A Tongue Between Nations, talks about Obeah and spiritual work as a kind of art of crossover, as spiritual workers from African traditions treat a diversity of clients, including Hindus, Muslims, people of African descent, people of Indian descent, people of various Christian groups, and have to learn how to work between these groups and call this work of crossover science. So rather than secularism or science as the transcendence of difference, I look at the work of crossover as another form of secularism, the mediation of difference. In part 3, The Heights, I deal with the equation of Obeah and science in the Anglophone Caribbean. And I take seriously the possibility that Obeah is science without putting that in scare quotes. The equation of Obeah and science goes back to the earliest colonial records that recount Obeah as a kind of science brought from Africa in British colonial documents. But the word is used in different ways by spiritual workers today. Some scholars have read this use of the word science as a kind of legitimating mask or garb for Obeah, using a word that has associations with Western modernity in order to legitimate a stigmatized African practice. But rather than embracing this divide between Africa and Europe, I look at the ways that science is not a legitimating mask, because science itself is morally ambivalent. Science is dangerous. And that's precisely why science can be equated with Obeah, because they both connote power, but also the potential benefits and dangers of power. And so I look at how this conception of science actually resonates better with more recent philosophy of science and feminist science and technology studies, who are looking at the morally charged, ethically charged nature of science in its practice. And I show how spiritual workers actually led me to re-theorize science and the ethics that are involved in the practice of anything called science. In the epilogue, I look at questions of tolerance. And this shows that a kind of an altar showing the kind of religious diversity that would be involved in an African religious shrine in Trinidad, involving Hindu, Egyptian, and Christian iconography. The background tapestry is meant to evoke the spiritual nation of China as well. So chapter 6, High Science, deals with the equation of Obeah and science. The epilogue deals with questions of tolerance. I argue that to have true religious tolerance, we must redefine the very moral racial fictions that define religion as a category and that have underlain Obeah's stigmatization. I look at cases from Texas to Brazil to South Asia to Canada and back again to Trinidad and Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean to look at the ways that African religions continue to be criminalized through this moral racial economy. So one example is the case of Jose Merced versus the city of Euless, Texas in the Dallas area, which was the first case of the Texas Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There's a kind of interesting story there. But he was a practitioner of Lukumi Afro-Cuban traditions whose practices were criminalized. He won that case. More recently, I was called by a reporter on this case of 11 people who were arrested for performing an Afro-Cuban ritual in San Antonio. As you can see from this Christian newspaper, it's conflated with Satanism. It's called grotesque. And so this replays the kind of moral racial foundations of the category of religion. And so I argue in the book that we have to approach religion through what is excluded from the category of religion, through the shadows of religion that have defined religion throughout its history as a modern category. Then there's the Church of the Lukumi versus Hialeah, which was in the Miami area, which reached the Supreme Court. In Brazil, there's more recent cases of shrines of African religion being decimated or consecrated or burned, and even deaths at the hands of people desecrating these shrines. Again, this is the San Antonio case of the 11 people arrested. And so I go through these cases and more recent arrests and deportations around Obeah in the Anglophone Caribbean to argue that although all of the constitutions of these countries enshrine religious tolerance, there are fundamental limits to that tolerance because of the moral racial limits of religion as a category. And so the book is really detailing these moral racial fictions and showing how Obeah leads us to question these fictions. And it does so through rethinking questions of justice, science, race, ethics, and religion itself. And so I think I've talked enough now. I'll turn it over to Dr. Mosquera, who has kindly agreed to offer some questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Crosson, and also thank you so much to Paloma. So I want to begin by congratulating Dr. Crosson for such a theoretically rich and well-argued book. It is a superb piece of ethnographic scholarship, and it was a pleasure to engage with your ideas. So thank you for inviting me to read that thing through your work. So I entered Dr. Crosson's text from the perspective of an interdisciplinary ethnographer whose work revolves around the understanding of the politics of Afro-Venezuelan social movements and how part of the cultural politics encompasses and espouses the retrieval of Afro-diasporic practices in building a project of Black consciousness. While religion is present, but not at the core of my research, it is an area that I have been interested in for a long time due to its entanglements with politics in Venezuela. In the case of Afro-Venezuelans, their spiritual retrievals take part in an environment that favors the visibility of popular Afro-diasporic religions, which seems radically different from the one that Dr. Crosson examines in Trinidad. In Venezuela, a self-defined Catholic nation, it is common and not incompatible with the presence of practitioners and spiritual workers of the already well-established cult of Maria Leonza. An indigenous goddess whose cult encompasses Kardashian practices of spiritism. Devotees ask for protection of solving everyday problems by seeking counsel from the spirits of the dead arranged in different cortes. Namely the Viking, the African Libertadora, or made by independent zeros, and the criminals or the Malandra, to name a few. So this has helped to symbolically hold together a racially diverse population under the umbrella of the ideology of mestizaje, of racial mixture, which is an ideology that also conceals entrenched racial and class disparities in Venezuela. Similar to Maria Leonza, we have the galvanization of Afro-Cuban practices such as the Regla de Ocha or Santeria, Palomayombe, and Palomonte. While these practices began with the arrival of Cuban nationals during the 1960s, which here overlap with the early years of the Cuban Revolution, more circulation of Afro-religious Cuban practices have deepened during Chavez and Maduro's era due to the Cuba and Venezuela economic and political ties. I am mentioning this context to clarify how the politics of visibility or how the social acceptance of these religious practices operates within a sociopolitical landscape in which this state doesn't legally prohibit these practices. Instead, the state has incorporated them into political dynamics that have made them vulnerable to corruption. Whereas Obeah, which is the focus of your book, was a criminalized practice in Trinidad and continues to be stigmatized and forced to be kept behind closed doors. With these diverging spaces to understand the place of Afro-diasporic spiritual practices in the Caribbean, I want to begin my comments. I want to zoom in on key lessons from the book that help to shape my thinking while I'm conceptually grappling with the role of spirituality and the ontologies of Blackness and resistance, which were the angles that I encountered while engaging with your book. So your book explores Obeah, an Afro-Caribbean diasporic tradition banned since the 18th century and only decriminalized in Trinidad in the year 2000. I was struck by how you intentionally avoid defining what Obeah is and instead ask what Obeah does, to center the voices, life experience, sensory memories, and images incorporated in the text that also interlaces Afro-diasporic spiritual practices such as the Orisha, the Hindu practice of the Kabbalah, and spiritual baptisms as influencing Obeah. So Obeah in your work encompasses healing, protection, and counsel, as well as a potential to harm when used for instrumental purposes. Nonetheless, hegemonic ideas permeated by Western racist logic historically equated Obeah with sorcery and witchcraft. So you discussed modes in which Western colonial technologies that emerged to suppress Black liberation. So key moments in the book signal moments of Black liberation, tracing back to the 1760s Taki rebellion in Jamaica, when African enslaved leaders used prayers and powders for protection and water battle against British colonial forces. So this historical moment laid the foundation for the criminalization of Obeah in the Caribbean. But what I was struck here was by how you demonstrate how disciplining Black life and Black rebellion by a colonial power entail removing populations from spiritual ontologies in connection to African epistemologies through the entanglements of sovereignty and the law. So also you explore how the stigmatization of Afro-religious practices steaming backward and are often used to explain underdevelopment of Black nations in a way that is encompasses multiple scales. So you say about other Black nations are also encompassing the notions of Afro-descendant neighborhoods. So I'm broadly justified in states of emergency and feeding geopolitical interests and military interventions in the Caribbean basin. So the book is successful in debunking stereotypical notions of Afrocentric religiosity as deviant and an obstacle to development. So your book provided me with fascinating insights that weave the fine-grained descriptions, dimension, and theory to understand that Obeah's denigration doesn't rest solely upon colonial discourses. So instead you show by parsing through 11 years of ethnographic engagement with spiritual workers the limits of religion whilst conceptually holding in tension Western colonial logics that shape Obeah's criminalization, science, ethics, moral, the rule of law, and citizenship. Also, you give pause for thinking more deeply and resisting the imposition or forcing the analysis of Obeah as a religion. Instead, you challenge us to rethink how we approach Obeah by starting with questions embedded in the limits of religion itself and disentangling its tensions with the role of spirituality and the everyday politics of the racially marginalized and socially disenfranchised, which I found fascinating in the book. So you ethnographically weave the interludes of the spiritual journey of Arlena, a young woman who was gunned down alongside her two friends by police forces in 2011, and whose murders are yet to be legally punished. However, justice is an ongoing process in the book. Claiming justice by experimenting with various practices to produce different outcomes is a form of science, as you argue. So as an Obeah practitioner, as Arlena's spiritual father opens up possibilities not only for collective action in the form of public protests and road blockages, but also modifying Obeah's spiritual practices to lay the body of Arlena to rest or unrest, thus enabling Arlena's spirits to seek justice. Questions about the effect and whether or not these Obeah practices find justice for Arlena and her friends murdered are left to the reader's understanding. Instead, what I found interesting, how was this ethnographic analysis drives home the relationship between spirituality, the disposability of Black bodies in areas rendered by the state as ridden by sorcery and criminality, everyday politics of resistance by the popular or lower class, and their alternative paths for justice within a bureaucratic and punitive system in which justice is elusive and not often on the side of the more marginalized populations. I was also struck by how you made painstakingly clear how the power produced subaltern identities through race and class-making processes, and also permeates the realm of religion to control and surveil Afro-Trinidadians. And thus power is dialectical in Rio Moro. So rather than vertical and unidirectional in your analysis, power is a vector that travels in multiple ways. So power, which is a key takeaway in the text, is not top down, as you write, open quote. Obeah exists in this exceptional space of overturning, subverting, or suspending norms to open an entrenched state of affairs or to alteration, end of quote. It flows in different motions, and Obeah's spiritual workings through power provides the ground not only to subvert and possibly open an unequal status quo, but also as a site where spiritual workers engage in the rich process of building theory through catching power, and practices they routinely and explicitly refer to as science. Here, what you execute brilliantly is how to show that Afro-centered cosmologies provide a canvas for theory making, a move that I salute, and represent this epistemological knowledge as experiments and science in the ways that they are theorized by spiritual workers. So your book doesn't explicitly propose a decolonizing methodology. However, you are explicit in showing how your research interlocutors guided the theoretical groundwork, making clear that spiritual workers are theorists and is their theorization of Obeah one of power. So this experimental approach is a theoretical move that also receives both objectifying and romanticizing religious practices by leaving this authoritative voice of theory building to your interlocutors, and thus implicitly making an intervention on how we as a scholar can approach the decolonization of our research. I was also fascinated by how you carefully pointed out the ambivalence within the stigmatized potential of Obeah for harm. Instead, what it comes in the text as a form of agency in your analysis is that neither sanitize nor demonize. It recognizes potentials for harm, and it is precisely in that power in which spiritual workers draw on to bring justice to those who have been harmed, and that you bring into sharp relief this ambivalence. So this is not about turning the other cheek, as your research interlocutors make clear in the text. This is about justice-seeking practices where spiritual workers and Obeah devotees dismantle the narrow boundaries of Western science and create a potential engagement of traditional practices as a pathway to right structural wrongs. Finally, I was also struck by how Obeah provides an important jumping off point to understand embedded dynamics in Trinidad and Trinidad's highly diverse racial formation. Cosmopolitan, as you mentioned, that goes beyond describing some of the existing tensions between the two groups, but you retrieve the layered interconnections between Hindu-Trinidadians and Afro-Trinidadians and their diverse intentions when engaging with Obeah. Even some Hindi Kali spiritual practitioners are criminalized by supposed use of Obeah. So here my question is more, to open up this conversation, is more about race and the central role of Blackness and the nation of Africa within this religion economy. So I wanted to understand a bit more deeply what the role of Blackness and why Africa seems homogenized within this religious cosmopolitanism that you mentioned in the text. So I'm asking this question because I'm interested in Venezuela. There, in the case of some Afro-Venezuelan social movements, there is a tendency to now retrieve specific groups in Africa to claim into or to feed into these religious and also cultural political processes. So retrieving identities and mentioning explicitly Congo, Bantu, and Yoruba, to name a few. But I wonder if there are similarities in the case of Afro-Trinidadians and also amongst Obeah practitioners using similar kind of languages when referring to Africa.
Thank you, Dr. Mosquera.
Brent, if you allow me, just before you take over, I just want to remind everyone, if they would like to pose a question, please write it on Facebook and we will make sure that Brent can answer those. So sorry, go ahead.
So it's okay to call me Nadia.
Oh yeah, thank you, Nadia. Yeah, and you can call me Brent as well. I appreciate that question. It's difficult to explain the complexity of Trinidad and the complexity of African religions there, as is the case in other places. There are multiple Africas at play, and Africa is not just a continent. I think I talk about it in the book as a house that contains many mansions. Now, I don't know what they meant in the Bible exactly, that the biblical scholars say something different, but I think of a mansion as something bigger than a house. And so Africa is a continent, but it contains many ideas of Africa and many different Africas. Some of them we could think about as geographical locations or ethno-linguistic groups, which he pointed to with Yoruba, Congo, or these are also political identities, the Kingdom of Congo being a political entity. So basically in Trinidad, there are 3 streams of African identified religious practice. 3 principal streams. One are the spiritual Baptists. Now there are people, for example, Burton Sankarelli, who's a intellectual from Trinidad, who elaborates a Congo genealogy for the spiritual Baptists. And this is convincing and it's consistent, but it's not elaborate. It's not necessarily elaborated amongst practitioners. And the Central African genealogies have been not as publicized as Yoruba and West African genealogies. So the spiritual Baptists, I think it's convincing that they could have a Congo genealogy, but at least they're marked as an African religion, and spiritual travels in Africa do go to different groups, to travel to different ethno-linguistic groups. And so Africa is differentiated. Then there's Orisha, which is like Santeria or Lukumi or Regla de Ocha, is marked as a Yoruba practice, and so is identified with the Yoruba ethno-linguistic group. But even Orisha in Trinidad has, I talked about Mama Lata, who has a French patois name, not a Yoruba name, who's an Orisha. There's also the Congo Ogun. So there's a Congo marked Orisha as well. And so it's not simply mono-ethnic either, but is usually thought of as being Yoruba inspired, and especially in the kinds of forms of practice that are popular in Venezuela and to some extent in Trinidad, that Yoruba genealogy is really important, and there is a purification sometimes that gets pushed about going back to some authentic source. And then there's the Kabbalah, which isn't a Hindu practice, it's an African practice, but its center of gravity, I would say, is Egypt. Egypt is in Africa. It's a different part of Africa. It's a whole different spiritual landscape. It deals with different texts. It deals with the Hermetic corpus, for example, and lots of esoteric texts that have been important for esotericists around the world. But the center of gravity for Africa there is a different one. It's Egypt. There's also Rastafarianism, which is popular in Trinidad. Their center of gravity, although that's certain kind of counterbalanced by the popularity of West Africa today, their center of gravity was Ethiopia in East Africa. So just thinking about it geographically, there's different Africas that become emblematic of Africa as a project in the Caribbean. So Ethiopia, Egypt, Yoruba land, and Central Africa, the Congo are like pretty far apart, but they can all be Africa. And so when people talk about being African and practicing African religion, there can be different projects that Africa entails in that. And so that's a point that I make in the book, is that Africa is not homogeneous. It's a project, often a project rather than simply a place, and it can be, it's a project that's enacted differently. So yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of other questions though about this spiritual identities, because spiritual identities don't, in Trinidad, amongst spiritual Baptists in particular, don't always coincide with phenotypical or census identities. And so somebody of African descent could be Indian in the spirit without having any known biological descent from India. And so there's also a notion of the person as being multiple and having multiple identities in different realms. So it's also a different notion of the person, where a person is not necessarily glued one-to-one to a single identity that's mutually exclusive from all other identities. So, I mean, I could go on and on about that, but that's just, it's really complicated, but I think that's also a different model of religion making as well, because we have this model of religion where we have mutually exclusive confessional communities. You can't be a Muslim and a Christian at the same time. African religions, and a lot of, if we really look closely, a lot of religious traditions think about identities differently and practices differently, where you can have separate practices that somebody can practice in parallel or that are good for different things and can be practiced at different times, but whose integrity as separate things is honored.
Brent, I have a question, if you allow me here. So what would you say are the main shortcomings of mainstream religious studies when it comes to studying Afro-diaspora religions and religious practices? And here maybe I'm going to use rose-colored glasses and say that academia has changed a little bit in the last 20 years. There are different voices in academia. There are people like you who have a different approach, and there are scholars who come from the regions that were under study. What shift have you seen in the scholarship that's coming out now from the one that you were reading when you were at grad school about these topics?
Well, one of the bodies of literature that I critique is the, within the, I'll talk about the anthropology of religion, and to some extent this has been applied in religious studies, is the ethical traditions model, and this basing of religion on virtue ethics, coming out of a lot of anthropology of Islam, but also anthropology of Christianity. And I found that limiting, and it's hard to think about this because it's hard not to revert back into this framework of good versus bad. So you have good religion that's involved in ethical subject making good people, and then bad religion, which is out to get money or power or to coerce people, or so we have all kinds of categories of cult, superstition, mega church, or whatever's engaging in an instrumental practice rather than a purely ethical one. And I find this kind of purification of religion within the scholarship to be troubling, because I think that the category of religion was a part of a Western project of de-ethicizing exchange, basically. I think that's what I mean, our exchange is ethicized still, but there's a tendency to try to de-ethicize and de-spiritualize exchange. And this leads to a kind of bifurcation of ethics, where you have the good realm over here of ethical subject making. And so at the height of the slave trade, a good Christian could be a good Christian and could also, be profiting off the slave trade. And there is some way that this could be reconciled by de-ethicizing exchange to some extent. Now, not for everybody, right? Because there's the abolitionist movement who are all about making good Christians out of people. But that also has its violence, this idea of making good Christians or making a good religious subject, and that people need to be reformed is another kind of violence. And so I find even in that project of making religion into some kind of ethical domain, there's a kind of violence inherent in that. And so I tried to write against the tendency to make good religion or to conflate religion simply with ethical subject making as part of the project of Western modernity, and this bifurcation of, again, Nadia, you mentioned instrumentality. We still have this notion that we have instrumentality over here, something that does something to achieve it in a certain effect. And then on the other side, we have ethics, devotion, family, love, all these realms that are not supposed to be commodified and based on exchange. That's part of the project of modernity, but there's a kind of, I want to say that there's a kind of violence inherent in that. And so I look at something like Obeah, where Obeah is understood to get something done in some way, to be trying to get something done. There is some kind of exchange happening, even if it's gift exchange, between a spiritual worker and a client. There's an understanding that some kind of material exchange is happening for the spiritual work to take place. And so all these things all these things are not exceptional. All religion involves exchange, even if it's usually not commodified, right? You go to church, you give a donation, maybe there's some pressure to give a donation. There's always some kind of exchange. And it's the same with Obeah. But Obeah gets kind of conflated with all of these bad ideas of instrumentality. And so I want to show how what I call religion shadows the things that were kind of cast out of the category of religion and criminalized, reveals the limits of this ideal of religion, which doesn't even exist in practice, right? Because, exchange never really stops. There's always some form of exchange happening, but there's still this ideal of religion, love, family, etc., being not based on exchange. So I guess I was writing in the first chapters against this ethical traditions model in the study of religion. In the next sections, I'm writing against the conflation of race and religion with respect to non-Abrahamic traditions, I think. And in the final section, I'm writing against the ways that science studies and religious studies have been not talking to each other, in part because we consider science and religion to be separate or opposed domains, at least since the late 1800s. And so I want to kind of bring religious studies and science studies into conversation. And so that's something else I see as like being something that could revitalize the study of religion, is thinking about the theorization of science and the practice of science, and then reflecting back on the practice of ritual through the theorization of experimental practice.
Brent, in your next project, you're working in climate change and religion, right? I want to give you the last minute before we go to talk about the event you're planning for next month.
Oh yeah, April 28th, we're having an event called After Disaster, Catastrophe in the Caribbean Longue Durée. And so we'll have Ryan Cecil Jobson from University of Chicago. We'll have Bedora Lagra from African and African Diaspora Studies at UT, and Carlos Ramos from LLILAS, as well as an activist and educator, John Mussington from Antigua. And we'll be discussing the idea of disaster in the Caribbean, both with respect to recent hurricanes and the aftermath of those hurricanes and disaster capitalism, but also the potentials and limits of considering the Caribbean as a region that is based on catastrophe in some way, with the plantation and slavery being a kind of foundational way of thinking about the region. And so Bedora Lagra's work, for example, is about a kind of endless catastrophe, this idea of catastrophe in the past 500 years in the Caribbean in intellectual history. So that'll be April 28th, and it will just be a virtual event. It's on the Caribbeanist Labs and Religion website, which is on the UT Religious Studies webpage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nadia. Good to see you again. Thank you so much, Brent. And we're looking forward to the next book. Okay.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.